The Chicago restaurant was silent the moment Julian walked in. Every waiter straightened. Every customer lowered their eyes. This was his territory, and everyone knew it. But then the doors burst open so violently the glass rattled. A little girl, maybe 6, sprinted inside alongside her fiercely protective older sister, Clara. Tears streaked down her cheeks, breath shaking, hair tangled like she had run miles. She did not stop at the counter. She did not look for help. She ran straight to Julian before the guards could even raise their guns. She grabbed onto his coat with both hands and sobbed. "He is coming. Please, he is coming." The entire restaurant froze. Julian knelt down slowly, his voice low and steady. "Who?" he asked. "Who is coming for you?" The girl's lips trembled. She whispered Victor's name, a name that made 2 of his guards swear under their breath. A name Julian had not heard in years, one that should have stayed buried. In an instant, Julian stood up, chair crashing behind him, eyes burning with fury. No hesitation, no questions, no negotiations. He stormed out of the restaurant, his men moving like a dark tide in his wake. Whatever that little girl said, it was not just a warning. It was a declaration of war. As Julian reached the exit, he did not look back, but his command cracked through the silent room like a gunshot. "Bring them." Clara's lungs burned as she stood paralyzed in the sudden vacuum of his departure. She had dragged her little sister, Mia, through 3 miles of frozen alleyways, dodging the sweeping headlights of black sedans that prowled the streets like starved wolves. Her worn, tape-patched sneakers were soaked with freezing slush, and every muscle in her battered body screamed in agony. For weeks, Clara had been invisible. A struggling 24-year-old waitress, pulling double shifts just to keep the heat on in her crumbling apartment. But tonight, the shadows had turned deadly. Victor's men had come for them. Now, she stood in the wake of the most dangerous man in Chicago, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. One of his men, a giant with a scarred jaw, placed a heavy but surprisingly gentle hand on Clara's trembling shoulder. "Move," he murmured, steering her and the sobbing 6-year-old toward a waiting fleet of armored vehicles parked along the curb. The biting winter wind whipped through Clara's threadbare sweater, making her violently shiver, but she refused to let go of Mia's hand. She hesitated for a fraction of a second when she reached the open door of the massive vehicle. The opulent, cream-colored leather interior smelled of expensive cologne and power. It looked like a completely different universe compared to the damp, rat-infested basement they had been hiding in for the past 5 days. "Get in," Julian's voice cracked through the frigid air like a whip. He stood by the lead car, his custom-tailored black overcoat catching the amber glow of the street lamps. His dark, ruthless eyes locked onto Clara, stripping away her defenses in a single, piercing glance. He saw the purple bruises blooming along her jawline. He saw the desperation in her posture, the way she shielded the child with her own fragile body. Before Clara could respond, the screech of tires echoed from the far end of the avenue. 2 black sedans tore around the corner, their high beams blinding in the darkness. Victor's scouts. They had found them. Clara choked on a gasp, instinct forcing her to push Mia behind her legs. But Julian did not even flinch. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering under his sharp cheekbone. He simply raised 2 fingers. The street instantly erupted into controlled chaos. Julian's guards drew their weapons with the synchronized, metallic snap of steel, stepping in front of Clara like an impenetrable human wall. "Take out the tires," Julian commanded, his tone so calm it was terrifying. "I want them alive. They have questions to answer." Gunfire shattered the quiet night. The sound was deafening, making Clara clamp her hands over Mia's ears. The lead sedan swerved violently as its tires blew out, crashing into a fire hydrant in a shower of sparks and freezing water. The second car slammed on its brakes, trying to reverse, but Julian's men were already swarming it, dragging the scouts out onto the icy pavement with brutal efficiency. Clara stood paralyzed, her breath frosting in the air. She had known Julian was dangerous. Everyone in the city whispered his name with a mixture of reverence and terror. But seeing his absolute dominance, the casual way he commanded violence, sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Julian pulled a sleek phone from his pocket, not taking his eyes off the captured men. "Initiate a full grid lockdown," he ordered into the receiver, his voice carrying the weight of a king declaring a siege. "No one enters the south side. No one leaves. Shut down the ports, block the highways, and mobilize every ear on the street. If Victor thinks he can breathe in my city without my permission, I want to know exactly where he inhales." He ended the call and walked slowly toward Clara, the men parting for him like the sea. He stopped inches from her. The sheer size of him, the heat radiating from his body, made Clara feel impossibly small. Yet, beneath the suffocating aura of danger, there was a strange, grounding stability. "Look at me," he said softly. Clara slowly lifted her gaze, meeting eyes that were like fragments of dark, freezing ice. "Victor's syndicate will not touch a single hair on your head. You belong to my protection now. Both of you." He reached out, his large, callous thumb gently brushing a stray, wet curl from Clara's bruised cheek. The touch was so unexpected, so shockingly tender from a man whose hands were stained with blood, that a tear finally slipped down Clara's face. "Get in the car, Clara," he whispered. She blinked, stunned that he knew her name. She had never spoken to him before tonight. She gathered Mia into her arms and climbed into the cavernous heat of the vehicle. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing them inside a fortress of bulletproof glass and tinted windows. As the engine roared to life and the convoy tore away from the wreckage, Clara pulled her sister tightly against her chest. She watched the blurry streetlights race by, her mind spinning. She had run to a monster to save them from a devil. And as she looked at the broad, unyielding shoulders of the Mafia boss sitting in the front seat, charting a course for war, Clara realized that her invisible, struggling life was gone forever. She had crossed the threshold into a dark, violent empire, and there was no going back. The armored vehicle glided through the frozen Chicago streets like a phantom. Clara held Mia so tightly her arms ached, her wide eyes fixed on the broad, unmoving shoulders of the Mafia boss sitting across from them. Julian Vance stared out the tinted window, his profile carved from merciless granite, illuminated only by the passing amber streetlights. The silence inside the cabin was suffocating, heavy with a violent tension that made the air feel too thick to breathe. Clara pulled her worn coat closer around her shivering sister, terrified to make a sound, but the silence was shattered when Julian's phone buzzed. He answered it and put it on speaker, the voice of the scarred giant from the alley echoing through the car. "We are extracting the data from the scouts now, boss," the voice rasped. "But the chatter confirms it. Victor is back, and he is hunting in your territory." Clara saw Julian's massive hands clench into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. "He is not hunting," Julian replied, his voice a lethal, frozen whisper. "He is digging his own grave." Clara swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she finally dared to speak. "Why?" she asked, the single word hanging in the air like a fragile thread. Julian slowly turned his head, his dark, freezing eyes locking onto her bruised face. For a moment, she thought he would ignore her or punish her for questioning him, but the raw exhaustion in her eyes seemed to extinguish a fraction of his fury. Victor ran the largest human trafficking syndicate on the eastern seaboard 20 years ago, Julian stated, his words clipped and heavy with a grief that felt bottomless. He stole children from playgrounds. He ripped families apart in the dead of night. And the police looked the other way because his pockets were deep. Julian leaned forward, the faint scent of gunpowder and expensive cedar washing over Clara. "He took my little sister when she was only 10 years old. I spent 15 years hunting him down, dismantling his empire piece by bloody piece. We raided his compound. We saved 40 children. But Victor vanished like smoke, and my sister was never found." The raw, agonizing truth in his voice made Clara's breath catch in her throat. She looked at this terrifying, untouchable king of the underworld and saw the ghost of a desperate, broken boy who had lost everything. He was not just a mafia boss protecting his territory. He was a guardian forged in the fires of an unimaginable loss. "I promised myself he would never take another innocent life," Julian continued, his gaze drifting to the sleeping 6-year-old girl in Clara's arms. "And I do not break my promises." The vehicle began a steep ascent, spiraling up the hidden ramp of a towering skyscraper that pierced the Chicago skyline. They pulled into a heavily fortified subterranean garage, surrounded by dozens of armed guards patrolling the concrete pillars. Julian stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light and immediately reached his large hands into the cabin. Clara instinctively flinched, but he bypassed her entirely, gently lifting the sleeping Mia from her exhausted arms with a surprising, shocking tenderness. The little girl instinctively buried her face into the collar of his custom-tailored coat, her small hands gripping the expensive wool. Clara scrambled out after them, her frozen sneakers slipping on the polished concrete. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper as she hurried to keep pace with his long strides. "My private residence," Julian answered without looking back, leading them into an elevator made of brass and mirrored glass. The penthouse occupies the top 3 floors. It is the most secure location in the city. "You and your sister will stay here until Victor is dead." Clara felt a surge of panic mixed with an overwhelming, desperate relief. "We cannot stay with you," she stammered, wrapping her arms around her own ribs. "We do not belong in your world. I just need a safe place to hide for a few days until I can figure out a plan." Julian turned to face her as the elevator. Doors slid shut, sealing them inside the rising steel cage. His physical presence was overpowering, forcing Clara to press her back against the cold glass. "You do not have a plan, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dominant rumble that vibrated right through her chest. "You have worn out shoes, a bruised face, and a target on your back. Victor is a predator who thrives on the desperate and the invisible. If you walk back out into that cold, he will find you and he will take her." He shifted his hold on Mia, his dark eyes softening just a fraction as he looked down at the fragile woman standing before him. "I did not ask you to belong in my world. I am telling you that you are under my protection now. There is no negotiation. There is no alternative." Clara stared up at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a woman who had fought for every scrap of survival, who had never relied on anyone because everyone had always failed her. But looking into the unyielding, fiercely protective eyes of the most dangerous man in Chicago, she felt her lifelong defenses begin to crumble. She gave a slow, defeated nod, surrendering to the terrifying reality that her life was now inextricably bound to a monster who had sworn to keep her safe. The elevator chimed softly, the doors opening to reveal a sprawling, opulent sanctuary of marble and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering, frozen city. Julian stepped out into his gilded fortress, carrying her sister like a precious treasure, and Clara followed him into the shadows, knowing her invisible life was finally, irrevocably over. The morning sun pierced through the massive windows of the penthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Clara awoke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs before she remembered where she was. She was not in her freezing, damp apartment. She was locked inside the gilded cage of Chicago's most feared mafia boss. Despite the massive, silk-draped bed in the center of the guest suite, Clara had spent the entire night curled on the hard hardwood floor right against the bedroom door, her body acting as a human barricade while 6-year-old Mia slept safely on the mattress. Every instinct she had honed over years of surviving in the shadows told her to run, but the heavily armed guards stationed outside the reinforced glass walls reminded her that escape was impossible. She slowly stood up, her joints aching, and wrapped her threadbare sweater tightly around her waist. She needed to know the layout of her prison. Stepping out of the bedroom, she navigated the sprawling, minimalist hallways. The sheer opulence of Julian's world was suffocating. Original paintings hung on the walls, and crystal chandeliers caught the morning light, throwing fractured rainbows across the room. Yet, beneath the beauty, the air hummed with lethal security. Cameras blinked quietly in the corners. Men in tailored black suits with holstered weapons stood near the exits, their eyes scanning the perimeter with cold efficiency. Clara ignored the lavish dining room and slipped into the massive, stainless steel kitchen. She moved with quiet precision, opening cabinets until she found basic ingredients. She did not want to rely on the Mafia boss's charity any more than necessary. She tied her faded apron, the only piece of clothing she had managed to grab from her waitressing job, over her clothes and began to knead a simple dough for flatbread. Baking had always been her armor, a mechanical task that kept the panic at bay. The scent of warm flour soon filled the cold, sterile air of the penthouse. She was so focused on pulling the hot pan from the oven that she did not hear the heavy footsteps approaching behind her. "You're bleeding," a deep, gravelly voice echoed through the kitchen. Clara jumped, nearly dropping the heavy metal tray. Julian stood in the doorway, an imposing figure dressed in a crisp black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and dark ink. He looked less like a businessman this morning and more like the ruthless enforcer who had built an empire on blood. Clara quickly hid her hands behind her back, her cheeks burning with an unfamiliar heat. "It is just a scrape from the alley," she lied, her voice defensive and tight. Julian did not accept the lie. He crossed the kitchen with slow, predatory strides that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. He stopped so close she could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame, smelling the intoxicating blend of dark roast coffee and expensive cedar. Without asking for permission, he reached around her and gently grasped her wrists, pulling her hands forward into the light. Clara trembled as his large, callous fingers inspected her raw, blistered knuckles and the deep cut across her palm. "You fought them," Julian murmured, his dark eyes snapping up to meet hers with terrifying intensity. "When Victor's men cornered you before you reached my restaurant, you fought back." Clara swallowed hard, trying to pull her hands away, but his grip was unyielding, though surprisingly gentle for a man capable of such violence. "I had to protect Mia," she whispered, lifting her chin with a defiant glare. "I am not a victim, Julian. I do not need your pity, and I do not want your money. I just need a safe place for my sister until I can figure out how to disappear." Julian stared down at her, the harsh lines of his face softening into something dangerously close to awe. He was a man who commanded thousands, a king who watched powerful politicians tremble and wealthy businessmen beg for his favor. Yet here was a 24-year-old waitress, standing in his multi-million-dollar kitchen wearing taped shoes and a torn sweater, looking at him like he was just a man standing in her way. She was completely broken by the world, but her spirit remained utterly unbending. He released her hands and stepped back, pulling a sleek black box from the marble counter and pushing it toward her. "I do not give pity," Julian said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the room. "And I do not want you to disappear. Open it." Clara hesitated, her eyes darting from the box to his unreadable face. Slowly, she untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside lay a brand new, encrypted cell phone, a stack of crisp bills, and a heavy brass key to the penthouse. "This is not charity," Julian continued, his gaze heavy and intensely possessive. "This is a tactical necessity. You need to contact me if you feel unsafe. You need resources if my enemies breach these walls. And you need to understand that you are not a prisoner here, Clara." He leaned closer, invading her space until she was backed against the warm oven. "You slept on the floor last night. My security cameras caught you pacing the perimeter for 3 hours. Stop surviving for one day. Just breathe." Clara felt a sudden, terrifying flutter in her chest. For years, she had been entirely invisible, entirely alone in her desperate struggle to keep Mia alive. Now, the most dangerous predator in the city was not only seeing her, he was studying every detail of her pain and demanding that she rest. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice cracking under the immense weight of his undivided attention. "You do not know me. You owe me nothing." Julian reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against the bruised skin of her cheek, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her racing heart. "Because in a world full of cowards," he whispered, his eyes dark with a fierce, burning promise, "you are the bravest creature I have ever seen. And Victor will have to burn this entire city to the ground before I let him touch you again." The penthouse transformed from a gilded sanctuary into a heavily fortified war room within 48 hours. Clara stood in the doorway of Julian's sprawling office, clutching a cooling cup of black coffee, her eyes wide as she watched the underworld of Chicago mobilize. The massive glass walls that once offered a breathtaking view of the frozen city's skyline were now covered by glowing holographic maps and live surveillance feeds. Dozens of men in dark suits moved with lethal urgency, their voices a low, dangerous hum of coordinated violence mixing with the static of encrypted radio frequencies. At the center of the storm stood Julian. He had shed his suit jacket, his black dress shirt clinging to the broad, tense muscles of his back as he leaned over a sprawling table covered in satellite imagery. The scarred giant from the alley, whose name Clara had learned was Marcus, approached the table with a grim expression. They hit the South Side Community Center. "Boss," Marcus reported, his rough voice carrying across the room and making Clara's blood run completely cold. Victor's men tore the place apart looking for the girl. They're bribing the street cops and threatening the local clinic doctors. They left a message. Marcus placed a scorched, terrifyingly familiar object on the polished wood. It was a charred piece of blue ribbon. The exact same ribbon Mia had lost in the alley 3 nights ago. Clara's breath hitched, the porcelain mug slipping from her trembling fingers and shattering against the marble floor. The sharp crash silenced the entire room instantly. Every heavily armed soldier froze, their hands instinctively dropping to their holstered weapons as their eyes darted to the doorway, but Julian moved faster than any of them. He crossed the massive office in 3 long strides, his dark eyes entirely focused on Clara as she dropped to her knees, frantically trying to gather the jagged ceramic shards with shaking hands. "Do not touch the glass, Clara," Julian commanded softly, his massive hands gently but firmly gripping her wrists and pulling her upright. "You will cut yourself." He ignored the mess, his intense gaze searching her pale, terrified face. The dark bags under her eyes betrayed her absolute exhaustion. "He knows," Clara whispered, a tear spilling over her eyelashes as she stared at the burnt ribbon on the table. "Victor knows we are here in the city. He is going to burn your entire territory to the ground just to get to us. Julian, your men are bleeding because of me. You have to let us go." The words tore from her throat, driven by a lifetime of carrying her burdens entirely alone, always believing she was a curse to anyone who tried to help her. But Julian's expression hardened into a mask of terrifying, possessive dominance. He stepped closer, crowding her against the heavy oak doorframe, his towering frame completely shielding her from the eyes of his men. "Listen to me very carefully," Julian murmured, his voice a lethal, vibrating rumble that sent a fierce shiver down her spine. "Chicago belongs to me. The streets, the ports, the shadows, they all answer to my command. Victor is a dead man walking who just does not know his heart has stopped beating yet." He reached up, his large, callous thumb gently wiping the stray tear from her cheek with a tenderness that completely contradicted the violence of his words. "You are not a burden, Clara. You are the reason I am going to eradicate this sickness from my city once and for all." He turned slightly, his voice rising to command the room without ever breaking his physical proximity to her. "Marcus, activate the shadow network. I want eyes on every abandoned warehouse, every underground clinic, and every rusted shipping container from here to the state line. put a $10 million bounty on Victor's head alive. He does not get the mercy of a quick death. The men scrambled to execute his orders, the atmosphere crackling with a deadly, predatory anticipation. The heavy rain began to lash against the reinforced windows, mimicking the storm. Building inside the penthouse, Clara looked up at Julian, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had spent her entire life invisible, a fragile girl taping her worn-out shoes and running from monsters in the dark. She was so used to adults failing her, to the police looking the other way, and to the crushing weight of poverty keeping her silenced. Now, the most dangerous king in the underworld was systematically mobilizing an army to hunt the monster who had haunted her nightmares. He did not look at her like she was broken or temporary. He looked at her like she was the most valuable treasure in his heavily guarded empire, a queen standing in the center of a war zone. "I am going to keep you safe," Julian whispered, leaning down until his lips were inches from her ear, his breath warm against her trembling skin. "Both of you. And when I am finished with Victor, you will never have to run again." The absolute certainty in his voice wrapped around Clara like a heavy, protective blanket, terrifying and intoxicating all at once. For the first time in 24 years, she stopped looking over her shoulder for an escape route and instead leaned her exhausted body into the dangerous, terrifying warmth of the Mafia boss who was preparing to burn the world down just to keep her safe. The storm outside raged on into the darkest hours of the night, mirroring the relentless anxiety that kept Clara awake long after Mia had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep. The penthouse was mostly silent now, save for the muffled, synchronized footsteps of Julian's guards patrolling the outer corridors and the rhythmic drumming of freezing rain against the reinforced glass. Clara wrapped her thin sweater tighter around her shoulders and wandered into the sprawling, dimly lit library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves climbed the walls, illuminated only by the dying embers of a massive stone fireplace that cast long, flickering shadows across the room. She stood before the immense window, pressing her forehead against the cold pane, watching the icy rain batter the neon-lit streets of Chicago far below. She felt so entirely out of place in this world of unimaginable wealth and lethal power, yet the damp, rat-infested basement she had fled from felt like a distant nightmare. She did not hear Julian enter, but she felt the sudden, overwhelming shift in the room's atmosphere. The familiar, intoxicating scent of dark roast coffee, expensive cedar, and rain-soaked wool wrapped around her before he even spoke. "You should be sleeping," Julian murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to settle directly in her chest and calm her racing heart. Clara turned slowly. Julian had discarded his suit jacket and tie, the top buttons of his black shirt undone, revealing the faint edge of a dark, intricate tattoo over his collarbone. Without the heavy armor of his tailored clothes, the ruthless Mafia boss looked strikingly human, the absolute exhaustion of commanding a city-wide war etched deeply into the harsh lines around his eyes. He stepped closer, carrying 2 heavy crystal glasses containing a finger of amber liquid, and offered one to her. Clara took it hesitantly, her freezing fingers brushing against his warm, callous skin, sending a jolt of sudden electricity all the way up her arm. She took a small sip, the expensive whiskey burning a path of sudden, necessary warmth down her throat. "I have not slept a full night since I was 18, Clara confessed quietly, staring down at the glowing liquid as the silence of the room wrapped around them. Julian moved to stand beside her, his massive frame radiating an immense heat against her shivering body, completely shielding her from the draft of the glass. "Tell me why," he commanded gently, not as a ruthless boss demanding answers, but as a man desperately needing to understand the fragile woman who had unexpectedly breached his impenetrable fortress. Clara let out a shaky, uneven breath, the heavy, safe silence of the room pulling the truth from her carefully guarded heart. "My mother got sick when I was a teenager," she began, her voice trembling slightly as the painful memory surfaced. "Cancer. It ate through her body, and it ate through every single penny we had saved. When she died, she left behind crushing medical bills and a violent, unforgiving loan shark who demanded I pay her debts in blood or money. I had to drop out of school. I took every under-the-table cash job I could find, waiting tables for 12 hours a day, scrubbing floors until my knees bled, hiding in the absolute worst parts of the city just to keep me off their radar. I taped the soles of my shoes together with duct tape because buying a new pair meant we would not eat for 3 days. A single, betraying tear escaped, tracing a hot path down her pale, exhausted cheek. I have spent 6 long years making myself completely invisible, Julian. I learned that if people do not see you, they cannot hurt you. I just wanted to keep my sister safe. Julian's jaw tightened so fiercely that a thick muscle ticked beneath his scarred cheek. He slowly reached out, taking the heavy crystal glass from her trembling hand and setting it on a nearby mahogany table, completely eliminating the final barrier between them. He closed the remaining distance, framing her delicate, bruised face in his large, powerful hands. His rough thumbs gently brushed away the tear, his touch so devastatingly tender it made Clara's breath hitch violently in her throat. "They hurt you anyway," Julian whispered, his dark, freezing eyes burning with a fierce, possessive sorrow as he carefully traced the fading purple bruise along her jawline. "You carried the crushing weight of the entire world on your shoulders, and not a single person ever stood up to protect you." Clara looked up into the eyes of the most dangerous man in Chicago, a man who ordered executions and controlled a criminal empire, expecting to see pity, but finding only a raw, unyielding reverence. "You do not have to be invisible anymore, Clara," he vowed, his voice thickening with a raw emotion that completely stripped away every ounce of his cold, calculated facade. "I see you. I see every scar, every bruise, and every broken piece of your beautiful, unbreakable spirit." He leaned down slowly, pressing his forehead firmly against hers, pulling her small, trembling body flush against the hard, solid wall of his chest. The proximity was absolutely intoxicating. Clara could hear the heavy, steady thud of his heartbeat beneath his shirt, realizing in that singular, breathtaking moment that this terrifying predator was the only safe harbor she had ever truly known. "I will pay off every debt you owe," Julian murmured against her skin, his lips brushing dangerously close to hers with every word. "I will bury every loan shark who ever dared to threaten you, and I will tear Victor apart with my bare hands for bringing fear to your door." Clara closed her eyes, her small hands slowly rising to grip the dark fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself to the storm that was Julian Bance. She had run to him seeking a temporary shield from a monster, but as his strong arms wrapped securely around her, claiming her pain entirely as his own, she knew they had forged a profound alliance that went far beyond mere survival. They were two broken souls forged in unimaginable violence and loss, finding an unexpected, desperate redemption in each other's arms. For the first time in her life, Clara did not want to hide in the shadows. She wanted to stand directly in the light, beside the beautiful monster who had promised to burn the entire world to the ground just to keep her safe. By dawn, the library had been transformed into a tactical command center, the heavy mahogany tables now buried under blueprints of industrial warehouses, shipping manifests, and a terrifying array of matte black firearms. Julian stood at the head of the room, looking every bit the merciless king of the Chicago underworld as he addressed his elite strike team. "We hit the 3 distribution hubs at exactly midnight," Julian commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration that demanded absolute silence. "Marcus will lead the assault on the docks. We scorch the earth, gentlemen. Leave no route of escape and bring Victor to me alive." Clara watched from the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs as she listened to the violent orchestration of a citywide war. She saw the sheer volume of men, the deadly precision of their planning, and the terrifying reality of what Julian was willing to risk just to keep her and Mia safe. But as she studied the glowing holographic map of Victor's primary compound, an abandoned shipyard on the south side, a cold realization settled into her bones. Victor was a coward who thrived on shadows. If he sensed an army approaching, he would vanish, just as he had done 20 years ago when he took Julian's sister. He would disappear into the labyrinth of the city, and Clara would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. She stepped fully into the room, her voice shaking but entirely resolute. "He will not be there," Clara stated, silencing the room of hardened killers. Julian's head snapped toward her, his dark eyes flashing with a protective warning, but Clara forced herself to hold his gaze. "Victor knows how you operate, Julian. He knows you will bring an army. He will use his men as a shield and slip out through the underground maintenance tunnels before your strike team even breaches the main gates. I know those tunnels. I hid in them for 3 days when his scouts first started tracking us." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Marcus looked at Julian, waiting for the explosive reaction they all expected. Julian closed the distance between them in 3 long, predatory strides, his massive frame completely overshadowing hers. "You are not leaving this penthouse," Julian growled, his voice dropping to a terrifying, possessive whisper meant only for her. "I am not risking your life on a tactical gamble." Clara did not flinch, though her hands trembled as she reached out to grip the lapels of his black shirt. "You cannot lose him again, Julian," she pleaded, her amber eyes burning with a fierce, desperate courage. "If he escapes tonight, he will never stop hunting us. He needs a reason to stay above ground, a reason to walk directly into the center of the trap instead of running from it." She took a deep, shuddering breath, speaking the words she knew would tear his protective control to shreds. "I have to be the bait." The absolute fury that erupted in Julian's eyes was terrifying to witness. He grabbed her waist, his large hands gripping her with a desperate, crushing intensity as he pulled her flush against his chest. "Absolutely not," he snarled, the raw panic in his voice completely stripping away his composed facade. "I swore to protect you, Clara. I will burn this city to ash before I let that monster anywhere near you again." But Clara refused to back down. She pressed her hands flat against his racing heart, channeling the same unbreakable resilience that had kept her and Mia alive on the freezing streets. "You are protecting me," she whispered fiercely, her tears threatening to spill as she looked up into the eyes of the man she was rapidly falling in love with. "But I cannot be a prisoner to my own fear forever. Let me stand beside you. Let me draw him out so you can end this nightmare permanently." The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity, the air thick with an intoxicating mix of dread and absolute devotion. Julian stared down at the fragile, bruised woman in his arms, realizing that her spirit was forged from the same unyielding steel as his own. She was not a broken bird meeting a cage. She was a queen demanding her place on the battlefield. Slowly, agonizingly, Julian released a heavy breath, his forehead resting against hers in a gesture of profound, terrifying surrender. "If he gets within 50 feet of you, I will personally tear his heart from his chest," Julian vowed, his voice thick with a dark, lethal promise. He turned back to the room, his arms still wrapped possessively around Clara's waist, anchoring her to his side. "Change the parameters," he barked at Marcus, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Clara will be positioned at the designated extraction point, fully visible but surrounded by a 3-tier perimeter of our best snipers. I want thermal optics on every square inch of that shipyard. We use her to pin Victor in place, and then we close the jaws of the trap." The men scrambled to adjust the blueprints, the tension in the room skyrocketing as the stakes reached an unimaginable high. Clara leaned against Julian's solid, unmoving strength, her entire body trembling with the terrifying reality of what she had just volunteered to do. But as Julian's hand slipped down to securely intertwine his fingers with hers, she felt a surge of undeniable power. They were going to war, not as a mafia boss and a helpless victim, but as an unbreakable alliance, ready to drag the ghosts of their pasts out of the shadows and destroy them in the light. The freezing rain had turned the abandoned South Side shipyard into a graveyard of rusted metal and deep shadows. Clara stood alone in the center of a cracked concrete clearing, illuminated only by a single flickering halogen street lamp that buzzed like a dying insect. Her breath plumed in the freezing air, her worn coat soaked through, but she forced her hands to remain perfectly still at her sides. She was the bait. To the naked eye, she was completely vulnerable, a desperate girl waiting for a ghost. But hidden in the suffocating darkness surrounding the clearing, the deadliest syndicate in Chicago had the entire grid locked down in their crosshairs. Julian was perched in the rusted scaffolding of a crane 40 yards above, looking through the thermal scope of a high-powered rifle. His heart pounded with a terrifying, agonizing rhythm that he had not felt since the night he lost his sister 20 years ago. Every instinct screamed at him to drop the weapon, rush down to the concrete, and pull Clara back into the absolute safety of his arms. But he remembered the fierce, unbreakable resolve in her amber eyes, and he held his position, his finger hovering millimeters from the trigger. The silence was deafening, broken only by the relentless wind coming off the water. Then the shadows began to move. 3 black vehicles rolled silently through the rusted iron gates, their headlights completely extinguished to avoid detection. They fanned out like a wolf pack circling its prey, their engines humming with a low, predatory menace. The doors opened, and a dozen heavily armed men stepped out into the freezing rain, their weapons drawn and leveled directly at Clara. She did not flinch, though her pulse roared in her ears like a runaway freight train. From the center vehicle, a man emerged. Victor. He was older now, his hair completely gray, but the cruel, arrogant curve of his smile was exactly as Julian remembered it from the nightmares. Victor wore a heavy trench coat, walking with the casual confidence of a predator who believed he had outsmarted the entire world. Well, Victor's voice echoed across the empty yard, dripping with a sickening sweetness that made Clara's stomach turn violently. The little stray from the alley. You really thought you could run to Julian Vance and he would magically save you? He is just a frightened little boy playing king, and you are just another piece of garbage nobody is going to miss. Victor took a deliberate step closer, raising his hand to signal his men to grab her. Take her to the tunnels, Victor ordered, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. We will use her to send Julian a very bloody message. That was the exact moment Victor sealed his own absolute fate. Light them up, Julian commanded through the encrypted earpiece, his voice a freezing, lethal whisper that echoed in the ears of 30 elite operatives hiding in the shadows. The darkness instantly exploded into blinding light and deafening violence. 6 massive industrial floodlights flared to life simultaneously, completely blinding Victor and his men in a searing halo of white. Before they could even raise their hands to shield their eyes, the synchronized crack of sniper fire echoed across the shipyard. 5 of Victor's outer guards dropped to the wet concrete before they could pull a single trigger. Absolute panic erupted. Victor screamed a vicious curse, desperately lunging forward to grab Clara and use her as a human shield, but the scarred giant, Marcus, burst from beneath a rusted shipping container like an unstoppable force of nature. Marcus tackled 2 of Victor's guards to the ground, his heavy weapon roaring as he formed an impenetrable wall of flesh and steel between Clara and the human trafficker. Julian did not wait for the smoke to clear. He dropped the heavy sniper rifle, secured his tactical harness, and rappelled down the side of the towering crane with terrifying speed. He hit the ground running, drawing his dual sidearms, moving through the chaotic crossfire with the absolute, terrifying precision of a reaper collecting his long-overdue debts. Victor's men fired blindly into the blinding lights and deep shadows, their bullets sparking uselessly off the rusted steel containers, but Julian's crew operated with flawless military strategy. They neutralized the flanks, cutting off every single escape route and forcing Victor's syndicate back toward the freezing, black water of the harbor. Clara crouched behind a thick concrete barrier, her hands clamped tightly over her ears, watching in sheer awe and terror as Julian tore through the battlefield. He was a beautiful, terrifying monster, systematically dismantling the man who had brought so much pain and suffering to her city. A desperate guard managed to flank Marcus, raising a heavy shotgun directly toward Clara's exposed position. Julian saw the threat from 30 feet away. He did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He threw his massive frame across the slick concrete, firing twice midair, sending the guard collapsing just inches from Clara's barrier. Julian slid into the heavy cover beside her, his chest heaving, his black shirt stained with the freezing rain and the blood of his enemies. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his large hands frantically sweeping over her shoulders and pale face, completely ignoring the gunfire raging just yards away. "No," Clara choked out, gripping his tactical vest with desperate, shaking strength. "I am okay. I am okay." Julian's dark eyes burned with a fierce, possessive fire as he pressed a hard, breathless kiss to her freezing forehead. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice a low, vibrating growl that promised lethal intent. He turned back to the brutal battlefield, reloading his weapons with a terrifying, mechanical grace. The intense firefight had decimated Victor's forces, leaving the shipyard littered with broken bodies and shattered glass. But Victor was a survivor, a rat who knew how to scurry when the walls closed in. Through the thick smoke and the driving rain, Julian spotted the gray-haired trafficker sprinting toward the gaping mouth of the underground maintenance tunnels, desperately trying to vanish into the shadows one last time. Julian stepped out from the safety of the concrete barrier, his eyes locking onto the man who had haunted his nightmares for 20 agonizing years. The ultimate test of survival had arrived, and the King of Chicago was not going to let the devil walk away again. The gaping mouth of the underground maintenance tunnel swallowed Julian as he chased the ghost of his past into the suffocating darkness. Clara remained crouched behind the concrete barrier for exactly 10 seconds before the paralyzing realization hit her. She knew these tunnels intimately. She had mapped every dead end and rusted ladder during the 3 days she had hidden Mia from Victor's scouts. There was a secondary service shaft that looped directly behind the main corridor, a blind spot that Julian's satellite blueprints would not have shown. Victor was not running away. He was circling back to ambush the Mafia boss in the dark. Ignoring every instinct of self-preservation, Clara scrambled over the wet concrete and sprinted toward the rusted service grate hidden behind a pile of shipping crates. She dropped into the freezing, waist-deep water of the drainage canal, her torn sneakers slipping on the moss-covered stones as she waded into the pitch-black labyrinth. The air was thick with the stench of decay and stagnant water, muffling the distant echoes of the surface firefight. She pushed forward, her hands trailing along the freezing brick wall to guide her through the absolute darkness. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling violently, but the sound was swallowed by the dripping water. She reached the intersection just as a shadow detached itself from the wall. A massive hand clamped over her mouth, and a cold, sharp blade pressed directly against the frantic pulse at her throat. "I was hoping you would follow," Victor hissed, his foul breath hot against her ear. He yanked her backward, dragging her struggling body into the main corridor just as Julian emerged from the shadows, his dual sidearms raised and ready. The Mafia boss froze, his dark eyes widening for a fraction of a second before hardening into a mask of pure, absolute lethality. He saw the blade biting into Clara's pale skin, a thin bead of bright red blood welling up where the steel met her throat. "Drop the guns, Julian," Victor spat, his voice echoing off the damp brick walls. "Drop them or I open her throat right here, and you get to watch another girl bleed out because you were not fast enough to save her." The cruel reference to his murdered sister hung in the freezing air, a poison barb designed to break the king of the Chicago underworld. But Julian Vance was no longer the desperate, grieving boy Victor had created 20 years ago. He was a ruthless apex predator, and Victor had just made the final, fatal mistake of touching his queen. Julian did not hesitate. He let both of his heavy weapons fall, the metal splashing into the shallow water at his feet. "Let her go, Victor," Julian commanded, his voice so terrifyingly calm and devoid of emotion that it made the damp air freeze. "This is between you and me. You have nowhere left to run. My men have secured every exit, and your empire is currently burning to the ground." Victor let out a manic, desperate laugh, tightening his grip on Clara. "I do not need an empire," the trafficker snarled. "I just need a shield to walk out of here, and she is going to be my ticket." But Victor had underestimated the fragile, broken girl he was holding. Clara was not a helpless victim anymore. She locked her amber eyes with Julian's, reading the silent, deadly command in his dark gaze. In a single, explosive movement, Clara brought her heavy, duct-taped sneaker down on Victor's instep with every ounce of strength she possessed, simultaneously throwing her head backward to smash her skull directly into his nose. The sickening crunch of bone echoed through the tunnel. Victor roared in sudden agony, his grip faltering just enough for the blade to pull away from her throat. Clara lunged forward, splashing face first into the freezing water. That was the only opening Julian needed. Before Victor could even raise his weapon, Julian closed the 10-foot gap between them with terrifying, inhuman speed. He did not reach for his fallen guns. He wanted to feel the monster die. Julian's massive hands clamped onto Victor, one gripping the collar of his soaked trench coat, the other closing around the trafficker's throat with crushing, unstoppable force. He slammed Victor backward into the brick wall so violently the entire tunnel seemed to shake. "This is for the 40 children you kept in cages," Julian roared, the composed facade completely shattering to reveal the pure, unadulterated vengeance underneath. "This is for the families you destroyed." He drove his knee upward into Victor's ribs, the sound of breaking bone masked by the splashing water. "And this," Julian whispered, his dark eyes completely black with murderous intent as his grip tightened around the trafficker's windpipe, "is for daring to breathe the same air as the woman I love." He applied the final, lethal pressure. Victor's eyes bulged, his hands clawing uselessly at Julian's forearms, his desperate kicks growing weaker and weaker until his body finally went entirely limp. Julian held him against the wall for 5 more seconds, ensuring the monster who had haunted his life for 2 decades was completely, irrevocably dead. He let the lifeless body slide into the dark water and immediately turned, dropping to his knees in the freezing muck. Clara was struggling to sit up, shivering violently, her hands covered in mud and her own blood. Julian pulled her into his chest, his large hands trembling as he buried his face in her wet, tangled hair. "I have you," he choked out, rocking her small, freezing body against his rapidly beating heart. "I have you, Clara. He is gone. He is gone forever." Clara wrapped her arms around his broad, shaking shoulders, sobbing openly into his ruined black shirt. The 20 years of heavy, suffocating darkness that had haunted the Mafia boss were finally over, washed away by the tears of the incredibly brave waitress who had risked her own life to help him close the darkest chapter of his underworld empire. 6 months had passed since the freezing rain washed the blood and the ghosts from the South Side shipyard. The brutal Chicago winter had finally surrendered to the golden, healing warmth of spring, and the sprawling penthouse had transformed into a completely different world. Clara stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning sunlight bathing her in a soft, ethereal glow. She was no longer the desperate, invisible waitress shivering in a threadbare sweater and worn-out sneakers held together by duct tape. She wore a flowing white dress that brushed against the polished marble floor, her dark hair cascading freely down her back, her amber eyes bright with a profound, quiet peace. From the kitchen, the joyful, melodic sound of 6-year-old Mia laughing echoed through the hallways. Mia was baking cookies with Marcus, the towering, heavily scarred enforcer who had once terrified Clara, but who now wore a flower-dusted apron and let the little girl boss him around with absolute authority. Clara smiled, a deep, overwhelming wave of gratitude washing over her soul. She felt a familiar, intoxicating heat approach from behind before two massive, powerful arms wrapped securely around her waist. Julian pulled her flush against his broad chest, his chin resting gently on the crown of her head. He smelled of rich dark coffee, expensive cedar, and the crisp morning air. "You are awake early," Julian murmured, his deep, gravelly voice sending a wonderful shiver down her spine. "I was watching the city," Clara replied softly, leaning her full weight back into a solid, unyielding strength. "I was thinking about the freezing alleyways, the eviction notices, the constant, suffocating fear of not knowing if we would survive the night. It feels like a lifetime ago." Julian turned her gently in his arms, his dark, intense eyes searching her face with the same fierce, possessive devotion that had anchored her to his world on that very first night. "That life is completely gone, Clara," he promised, his callous thumbs slowly brushing across her cheekbones. "You will never know the cold again. You will never be invisible again." He meant every single word. After Victor was eliminated, Julian had completely dismantled the remnants of the trafficking syndicate, using his vast underworld empire to build an impenetrable fortress of protection around his city. But more importantly, he had built a sanctuary for the two broken souls who had unexpectedly brought light into his darkest corners. Julian looked down at the beautiful, resilient woman who had marched into a deadly crossfire just to save him, realizing that his wealth and his power meant absolutely nothing without her standing by his side. "You saved me, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with a raw, completely unguarded emotion. "I spent 20 years letting the ghosts of my past dictate my every breath. I built a criminal empire out of rage and grief. But you brought a light into my life that chased all the shadows away. You gave me a family." Clara reached up, her small hands resting gently against his strong jaw, her heart overflowing with a fierce, unbreakable love for the terrifying monster who worshipped the very ground she walked upon. "We saved each other, Julian," she answered, her voice steady and full of absolute certainty. "You showed me that I was strong enough to stop running, and I showed you that you are worthy of being loved." Julian leaned down and captured her lips in a deep, passionate kiss, a silent bow that echoed through the quiet penthouse. It was a kiss that tasted of salvation, of violent storms that had finally passed, and of a beautiful, untamed future. They were a king and a queen forged in the fires of survival, ruling an empire not built on fear, but on an unbreakable, desperate devotion. Just then, Mia ran into the room, her small hands covered in chocolate and flour, throwing her arms around Julian's legs. The ruthless Mafia boss immediately dropped to his knees, picking the little girl up and pressing a kiss to her messy cheek, his dark eyes filled with a pure, undeniable joy. Clara watched her family, knowing that true strength was not about avoiding the darkness, but about being brave enough to ignite your own light when the world tried to blind you. My dear listeners, thank you so much for staying with Clara and Julian through this beautiful, thrilling journey on Sunni romance. Their story proves that even the deepest scars can heal when wrapped in genuine, unconditional love, and that the family we choose is often the strongest armor we can ever wear. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the emotional tales we bring to you every single day. We truly want to hear from you. Have you ever faced an incredibly dark moment in your life that ultimately led you to something beautiful? Share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below, because we read every single one and cherish your incredible support. Wherever you are in the world, we wish you peace, radiant health, and the courage to demand the love you truly deserve. Thank you again, and we will see you in the next beautiful story.